Hey everyone, and welcome to week 2, night 2 of the backend section of Full Stack Web. So these 2 weeks, these 4 lessons have been dedicated to the idea of building a server, building an API, the different facets of that. We've explored all the different CRUD operations. We started to look into some of the fun bells and whistles that are built into Express on Monday. So we explored middleware. And then today we're going to look at another cool feature of Express's, which is routing. But really, I think that the main topic of tonight's lesson is going to be all about good practices, writing good code. We're going to talk about some specific ways to do that within an Express server, but I also want to talk to you in general about good coding and talk about things that are going to be applicable no matter what language or what stack or what project you're working on. And then we're also going to talk about deployment. So deployment is when we make our apps live instead of just existing on our local host. And then the last little topic that I'll actually cover right at the beginning or near the beginning is I've gotten some feedback that there was kind of consistent issues with the homework, mostly in terms of the custom middleware that you guys were asked, right? So I'll take a little moment to just go over that and maybe not give you the exact answer, but maybe I will give you the exact answer. But at the very least, we'll work through it together so that you guys can understand that a little better. So before I share my screen, I want to have a little chat with you guys just about coding and good practices and some things that I want you to be thinking about once again, not just in the server context, but in the context of all code you're writing. And as always, make sure you're asking questions in Slack with the big question mark symbol. But beyond that, definitely be participating in Slack as well. I'll keep an eye on that. So the first thing I want to bring up is this idea of what are we trying to do when we write code? And this is actually a question that I love to ask in my intro course because it's one of those questions that's so simple, it's almost impossible to answer. So what is our job as software engineers? What are we trying to do when we write code? Throw out some ideas. Solve a problem. That is a great one. Any other suggestions you guys want to throw out? Make the computer do what we want it to. That is always nice, but I will actually say that that's one of the secondly important things. Improve user experience, absolutely. We want to, whatever project we're trying to make, we want to deliver on that. Write something so that we can be more lazy. That is actually going to tie pretty critically into this good coding practice thing. Accomplish something, create readable code, achieve a task, all good answers. The answer I like to give in my intro class is actually stay calm in the face of the unknown. Be able to go from a stage of being confused and not understanding something to understanding. And that's, I think, an important takeaway too. But the answer I want to explore is actually an answer that I'm going to steal from one of our other instructors, Luis. And his answer is to create value. And that really ties into this improve the user experience, right? So presumably we're writing code, if we're writing code for ourselves for fun, we can, I guess, do whatever we want. But when we think of ourselves as professional developers, someone is paying us to write code. And that means we need to be creating value. And there's lots of ways to create value, to deliver to solve the problem that needs solving, to save both ourselves and our client time. And part of that is, saving time and money by writing good code, right? That is one of the best ways to create value, is to write something that's going to be reusable, that's not going to create a bunch of time and headache down the road as you fight with it or your fellow developers fight with it. So in order to be a really valuable programmer, we need to be able to write good, scalable, clear, readable code. And that brings me to this other point that actually someone already said, the create readable code thing. So it's easy to think of code as being instructions for a computer, which in a sense it is. But more importantly, code is also a way to communicate with other humans. It should be a tool that we not only use to communicate intent to the computer, but to our future selves or our fellow teammates or the person who takes over the project after we leave. So if our code is not readable, our code needs to be both readable by the computer, but maybe even more importantly, readable by other humans. And so I'm going to actually say something maybe kind of crazy, and that is that I would prefer to be handed a code base that's readable but has bugs in it than something that's unreadable but has 0 bugs. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that? And maybe you're different, but I personally would prefer to be handed a code base that's readable but has some bugs versus unreadable with 0 bugs. Why do you think that is? It is easier to understand quicker. And I love this answer. I could go in and fix those bugs. I feel pretty confident that I can, with minimal hassle, fix those bugs if the code is readable. And here someone has suggested the important thing. Chances are we're going to have to change the code down the line. Pretty much every case, the code is going to have to change at some point. So in the case of the readable code with a few bugs, yeah, it's a little more upfront hassle because I might have to go and fix those bugs. But when inevitably down the line, something changes, there's a new feature, there's an upgrade, there's a change in requirements, it's going to be minimal effort to change that code. If instead you hand me code that does one thing perfectly, but it's unreadable, it's going to work great until you have to change it, and then we're doomed. Then you have to start from scratch. And that totally sucks. Trust me, I've had to do it many times before. So that's really important. And a really important thing to keep in mind is this, like, you don't get tunnel vision with that end goal, because whatever your requirements are, it's going to have to change a little bit. It needs to work for the MVP, but it also needs to be mutable enough so that when you're adding new cool features, you can easily retrofit your old code to adapt to new things. There's this idea of brittle code. Brittle breaks easily. So we don't want to write brittle code. We want to write flexible code. And it turns out that just sticking with the criteria of making your code readable is already a great way to assure that your code's going to be good and flexible. So one really key technique to writing good readable code is the idea of writing modular code. Can anyone explain to me what modular code is? What makes code modular? And another way to say modular would be in small independent chunks. It's self-contained. So there's different components. So one place to start with when you're thinking about modular code is just with functions. The idea that every single function you write does something different. You have a process user function, and then a format data function, and then there's not if you're trying to generate a report, it's not just one giant generate report function. It's like, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, all these conceptually separate things have a separate piece of code. So the ideas and the structure of the code actually map. And then if you want to change, exactly, Kyle just said something brilliant, which is if you want to change out one piece, you can do that easily without breaking everything else. And I see another thing in Slack that is, I think, critical, which is it's not just about functions, it's also about files. It's also about not clumping a giant amount of information into one file. You want to separate different ideas. So smaller ideas will have their own functions, and then bigger ideas will have their own files. And even bigger ideas will have their own folders. And so in this way, the file structure and the code structure actually maps perfectly to the ideas behind it. And so we're going to learn some ways to do that more easily in Express today, but this is a concept that transcends Express. It's just an extremely, extremely important concept. So yeah, it sounds like you guys already have some great ideas about this. So in terms of, actually, I'm going to save that for a little later. So sorry, I'm like looking at my lesson notes and being like, I'm going to change the order. All right, so that's kind of a little like, let's sit down and have a chit chat about the ideas behind what we're talking about tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Things are going to be a little out of order. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to switch gears for a second so I can talk about this homework issue that it sounds like some of you guys were having. And then we'll go back to Express and start to talk about how these things we just discussed apply to Express specifically. So let me share my screen and we will talk about this, this to uppercase middleware thing. All right. Okay, so I've done something terrible. I apologize. I shared my code with you in a zip file, and then I decided to change what it was before the lesson. So don't freak out about all this code that I have up here that you guys aren't caught up on. This is just a little mock API that I put together. Don't be scrambling to type it up. I just want to talk through this idea. If you do want to put anything on screen, I would recommend this post as well as the basic stuff, because we're really talking about the post. But once we're done with this section, we're going to kind of start some stuff from scratch. So, okay. So let's talk about this piece of middleware. So a couple things on the homework, actually. One thing I just wanted to say is that, and I mentioned this on Monday, but you'll notice the requirements are a bit more vague on this homework. And that's maybe a little scary, but it's also good because it's forcing you to think in some different ways. It's not, you're not just asking, how do I write the endpoint, but you're starting to have to ask, what should the endpoint look like? What should the logic look like? And if you feel really stuck, I would just look at the README from last week's homework, and it'll probably give you at least a starting point. The next thing I want to mention on the homework really quick is there's this tag thing, right? So there's this tag resource that's actually somewhat built into the code base, but not part of the homework assignment. So that is, if you want to have another stretch goal for yourself, you can try to implement tags, some CRUD operations for tags. If you don't want to deal with tags, no worries. And if they're creating issues for you, reach out to your PMs and they can probably help you out with that. So I hope that there wasn't too much tag related confusion. I'm sorry for not mentioning that on Monday. And then the last piece is, of course, this uppercase middleware. So we want to write some custom middleware that does uppercasing. Well, let's start with, what is this thing supposed to do? So we have this post endpoint. It's totally mocked out. There's no database. All we're doing is pulling the user data off the body of the request, and then we're just basically sending back a 201 and sending back that info. So there's this invisible step in here, this missing step about actually entering into the database, but this should work just fine for understanding the middleware piece. So let's start by busting out Postman and making sure this is actually working the way we want. 1 second. Sorry, Postman doesn't want to. Doesn't want to move over to my other screen. There it is. Okay. So we want to post. We're on port 5050. API, it's API/users. And then let's go ahead and add a body here. So, oh, we already have a body. Nice. Left over from another lesson. So let's go ahead and send this request, make sure it's working all right. We can see we got a nice little log over here because we're still using that Morgan middleware. Okay, cool. So we got back this user object. The only issue is that we wanted, based on the requirements, we want this name on this user, Charlie, to be uppercased. And we want middleware to handle that. So if we were doing this without middleware, we could, just go ahead and write the code right here, that uppercases name. But we don't want to do that. And presumably the reason is because we might be receiving this user data in multiple places, and we want to make sure that this uppercasing logic catches any request that might have a user. So we're going to do it, instead of coding it right into the post request, we're going to do it in middleware instead. So who can tell me the first step for writing some custom middleware? When we want to write custom middleware, we need app.use or server.use in my case. All right, so this is always going to be necessary to use any middleware, and we could have plugged it straight into this guy here as well, but I think it's going to be a little more readable if we have a separate use. All right, and there is an anonymous function that goes in here. This will be our actual middleware function. Who can tell me what the 3 parameters for a custom middleware function are? Perfect. Rec, res, and next on top of it. Cool, so very similar to this callback that we're using these route handlers. We have the homies, but then we also have this next function, and that just tells us if we want to allow it to proceed, we can use next. All right, so we're interested in the user that's coming in on the body. How are we going to get access to that user? How are we going to pull out the value that's stored in that for that user so that we can manipulate it? Rec.body.name, exactly. So I'm going to go ahead and just store that. And so really the first thing I want to do is make sure that this name exists, because it's remember, this middleware is hitting all these functions. So rec.body might be, there might not be anything on it. And if there's nothing on it, if this is null or undefined, we're going to have some issues when we try to uppercase it, right? This has to be a string. So if we want it to be, we need some sort of checking. If we want it to be, we're probably fine if we just check if there's a name. We could get even more precise and make sure this type is string. But I'm feeling pretty good about just at least making sure that there is a name value on there. So we're going to say if there's a name, let's uppercase it. And then what do we want to do with this uppercased version of the name? Because right now it's just kind of floating in the ether and it's not being stored anywhere. So I have one suggestion, which is send it back. So I could do res.send. What's going to happen if I do res.send? Let's play with this. I see some other people have some other suggestions, but let's play with this. Cool, so I get just the name back in caps, but notice that if I send a GET request with the same body on it, will that work? So the body is not being properly read now, and now it's just loading forevermore. So we have some issues. At least something's not right about this. Part of it is that we do need an else for this. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's go back to this post request. So let me, come on, cancel. There we go. Let's try this again. So we get back just the name, but that's because we never even hit this post request. And we do want to hit the post request. The goal of this middleware isn't to stop any of the requests. So we need to store it back in the body. And I actually see one person has suggested the exact thing we want to do, which is we want to actually overwrite the old name with the new name. All right. And we need a next. So what we could do, if we put the next in here, we actually really don't need an else now that I think about it. If we put the next in here, our post request works. Cool. So we get back the full object, but the name has been uppercased. However, this code as it stands is going to create some problems for our other requests. Can anyone tell me why the code as it stands will create some problems for our GET request. And if you guys want some proof, we'll go ahead and send a GET while we wait. Because we can't guarantee there's this name, and there's nothing happening outside of this if statement. So honestly, we'd like to move this next out of here. Regardless of if there's a name or not, we do want this to move on. The point of this middleware isn't to prevent these routes from being hit. We just want to, in some cases, change the value of the name. So we want this next outside of the if statements. Let's make sure that it works now. Cool. So we're getting back this totally mocked out user array now. And if we send our post, it's still working. All right. Yes, it is not a gatekeeper, so we don't want to be blocking any of these route handlers. All right, so there's a little how-to and explanation of how you might be doing this uppercasing bit of middleware. Do you guys have any questions about this? How would we put this in a separate file? Good question. I'm actually going to save that question for later. Well, it's related to what we're going to do later, but no, let's just do it. So how would we put this in a different file? Well, we'd need a file for it. We have a little custom middleware thing here, actually just waiting for us. So let's go ahead and name this uppercase, not care. And uppercase, man, I'm just typing random things tonight. So I'm kind of just doing this. I will walk you guys through what I'm doing in just a second. Where is my index? Okay, so I'm actually going to copy this thing over, put it in my custom middleware file, and there we go. Come on. Man, what did I do? Okay, let's try this again. There we go. Okay, so what I've just done is I've taken this function and I've actually, instead of just having it be an anonymous function, I've actually saved it in a function called uppercase, and then I'm exporting it out. So it's in a separate file right now, this custom middleware file, and we've put it in the export. So we know it's going to be available in index.js. And you're right that you do not need you don't need a separate file for it. It's nice to have one because of what we talked about earlier about separating concerns and being modular, but it's not necessary. It just makes it a little prettier. So we see that we are actually not requiring that file right now. So I'm going to do const, I'll just say middleware equals require custom middleware.js. Cool. So now we're importing that this other file. And then if we want to plug our uppercasing middleware in, what would we put here to plug it in? Middleware, just middleware on its own. Keep in mind we're exporting a couple different potential middlewares here. So we need middleware.uppercase to specify that we want that function specifically, because middleware.uppercase is equal to this function. So it's just a different way. If this is the equivalent from the code's perspective, this is the equivalent of just copying in that anonymous function. But from the user's perspective, this is a lot more readable and it's a lot more modular. So we actually like this better, even though from the code's perspective, it's actually the same. I see I have a couple questions building up. Let me go ahead and answer some of those. Is it Express that creates module.exports? No, that's actually Node. So I remember mentioning this the very first night. It's tough when you're learning a couple new things because you don't know what's coming from what. So any Node repository you can use requires and module.exports. Those are both Node specific features. They do not rely on Express. Okay, here's a good question. Is it better to simply call middleware that only applies to specific requests in the request instead of building all middleware to work across all requests. Let me explain that question for anyone who doesn't fully understand. So this middleware, we had to use an if statement because we know that in some cases there won't be a name. And Julie was wondering, would it be better if instead of just globally using this, we actually specifically used it on any of the post requests? Actually, yes, I would say that is a better approach. So what we could do instead is just plop this right in here. And let's say that there were a couple other posts where we wanted to use this. We could put this directly in. You can actually put middleware as the second argument in a route handler. So in that way, we wouldn't have to worry about that if statement or it interfering with our GET requests. So that is a more sophisticated way to do this. And we're gonna learn about an even more sophisticated way to separate out middleware today. But since we hadn't really talked about that, it's perfectly fine to just put it up here where it's gonna hit all the endpoints. All right, do we have to assign rec.body.name to a variable? No, we don't. So we could have, and actually this is another computer versus human thing. So this, instead we could have just done if rec.body.name. What I just did is equivalent to what it was before. From the computer's perspective, there's no difference. But at least for me personally, as a human, I think this is a bit more readable, which is why I did it this way. So you'll find that I'm a big advocate in writing a couple extra lines of code as long as it makes what the code is actually doing a little more clear. Not a big believer in like chaining 80 methods all together. So that's, and everyone's gonna have their preference, but I am a firm believer that this is, it's okay to create an extra variable to create a little more readability. Yes, and especially when you're having to do something like rec.body.name, it's easy to get that wrong in one place. Okay, any other questions on this before we move on? All right, all is quiet, so let's move on. Okay, so I'm actually going to get rid of our beautiful little uppercase middleware because it will not help us in what we are doing. Okay, so this API has one resource as it stands, right? A user. And one of the shifts with the homework tonight is you're going to start to think about multiple resources, right? You have to deal with posts now. Users can make posts. And I don't mean posts in terms of post requests, but like blog posts. Though that now you guys know where the term post comes from, right? So can you tell me, how do I phrase this question? We want our apps to be scalable, right? We want to be able to make them bigger and bigger and add more and more interesting things. And one of the biggest starting points with that when it comes to writing a server, writing an API, is multiple resources. So based on everything you know, can you think of any issues that might start to arise as we write apps with multiple resources? So say you guys know how to write CRUD requests for different resources. So what issues might arise if I went and told you, okay, write a app that has 5 resources? It would get confusing. It would get complex. It would be less readable. So longer code bases, it's harder for someone to figure out what it does. 580,000 requests. There might be a bunch of middleware that shouldn't be used, right? If we're plugging all of our middleware in this one place, there's gonna, just like we saw, there might be middleware that's really only applicable for 2 endpoints that's now being run through all 150 endpoints. That's slowing down our server and making our code more confusing. It's not dry, right? There's going to be a lot of repeating of logic. Our attention span is better with small chunks than long information. There'd be a lot of code repeated. Cool. All good suggestions. There's another one that you guys kind of hinted at, but no one said explicitly, which is these are short little route handlers, right? Because we're not dealing with the database. But you guys saw how long even just one of these route handlers can get, especially with put requests. It can get kind of messy when you're handling this case and that case and catching and making sure the data is all right and making sure the user ID is valid. So this file would start to get really nasty, right? I mean, even the files you worked with last week with just 5 requests were already starting to get a little hairy. Now imagine if you had that times 10. Yikes. So we can already see what some of the issues are that are going to start to arise. And I will say some of these issues don't have a good solution. Like, one thing that I will probably fight with for my entire life is that when you start to write a bunch of these CRUD requests, it does get really repetitive. And sometimes you can write nice little helpers that help clean it up, but sometimes you end up trying to find the pattern and just making it awful and messy. So there is a fine line, but there's one very simple low-hanging fruit that will make life easier when dealing with multiple resources, and that is routers. So I've actually written a router already. And once again, don't panic, because don't be like, oh my gosh, there's so much code on the screen that we can't catch up with. I promise you, we will kind of start from scratch, and I will give you guys a chance to actually write this out. But for starters, I want you to just see a router. Okay, so over here in tab number 1, I have just a full Express server, right? And we can't see the whole thing, so I'll kind of do a scroll up and down. Over here, we have an Express router, which looks kind of like a server, but there are a couple things that are different. So before I even explain what a router is, what can you guys see, just from looking at the code up on the screen, what can you guys see that is different about the router versus the Express server? And I'll kind of keep doing some scrolling. The word router, constant router on line 3. That's true, but couldn't I just rename server? It would be confusing, but I could just rename server router if I wanted. So I wouldn't get too attached to that one. Let's see what else. I don't have server.use. It turns out even though I don't have it up here, I actually could have. This is totally valid. So even though I didn't have it up here, that's valid code. So I can use router.use. All right, what else, you guys? It's not a trick question. There are a couple things. There are a couple differences. No ports, or more importantly, no listen. So that's one of the big ones. There's a listen on our server, but there's no listen on the router. Ooh, I see someone got another one. My endpoints are different. I'm using a full endpoint over here and just a slash over here. There is actually a reason for that, which we will learn in a little bit. All right, there's one more. There were 3 things I wanted you guys to catch. There's one more. The file is a lot smaller. I'll give you a hint. It's on line 3. Or line 3 of the user router, slash. The router is part of Express. So notice, instead of doing router equals Express, I've done express.router. Okay. So hopefully that wasn't too horrible of a little thing that we've done. The router is actually middleware. So what we've created here, I haven't exported it, but this router is a piece of middleware that we are actually going to plug into this. So I know I've kind of just plopped you guys in without explaining it, but as I said at the beginning, that's part of the fun of being a developer. I'm actually going to wipe the slate clean now that you guys have a little bit of an intuitive sense maybe of what a router is. I'm going to wipe the slate clean and we will build this thing from scratch. All right, so let's say goodbye to the router. I promise it will come back. And I am actually going to get rid of all these endpoints too. All right. Do we have to have line 5? Which line file on which file? All right, I know I just got rid of everything. Okay, so let's start this again, and I'm going to use a slightly different example. So the example I want to use for this routing business is actually focused around a problem I'm working on right now outside of Lambda, which is oops, sorry, can you guys hear me all right? I've got a little notification that my internet was cutting out. All right, I'm gonna close Dropbox just in case. That will, okay, cool, that's good. All right, back over here. So, okay, so the example I'm gonna use is I'm working on just a little mini app right now for an inventory system at my coffee shop. And so there are a couple different resources we have to keep track of. So the 3 resources I want us to start thinking about, and we might not get to all 3, are, actually, let's just start with 2 resources. Keep it simple. 2 resources are sources and items. Right, so we have all these items that we keep on hand, but different items come from different suppliers. Actually, suppliers is probably a better term here. And it's often nice to think about these in terms of their suppliers because we receive them all together when they're from suppliers and we need to order them all together when they're from the same supplier. So let's think about doing a little API for this inventory system where we're trying to keep track of items and suppliers. All right. So, and we are going to start actually with suppliers. So let's go ahead and create some endpoint shells. And these endpoints won't be that interesting because we're not dealing with a database here. So we can do, and we're going to start by doing this the old fashioned way. So we'll do server.get API/suppliers rec and res. And then let's go ahead and I might not do all 4. Let's skip put. Let's do a post, suppliers, and then there's ID. Cool. So I'm gonna kind of go through this a little quickly. This should be mostly familiar. As I said, I am going to be kind of mocking this out. So we could do rec.json and send back. Here, do an object. Suppliers. And we might say coffee roaster, food vendor. These are some very generic names. Tea distributor, etc. Oh, I am missing. There we go. Cool. All right, and then as far as showing my app when I'm finished, for now the plan is that my app will actually just be a command line script attached to a back end. So hopefully there will be a front end on it eventually. But for now, I don't know if I can justify the effort that's putting in. Mostly we just need, I was just frustrated with working with Excel sheets that break so easily. And I was like, why aren't I just doing this in SQL? Plus it's fun to be able to do something dorky. Okay, so there's our little get. Let's do the post real quick. And we'll do supplier equals rec.body. And then All right, and then deleted. Oh, I'll just do 200. All right, cool. So very basic. Let's do a quick little, make sure it's working. Let me start my, and do you guys get a free latte coupon? If you come all the way down to Bisbee, Arizona, yeah, you guys get a latte on me. I think that's fair. All right, come on. Ah. All right, let's start her up. Cool. All right, let's get our Postman out, make sure this is working. There is suppliers, right? Looks good. If we do a get. Cool. All right, let's assume that's working all right. When does the coupon expire? Bisbee's actually not that hot, by the way, because we're up in the mountains. So everyone thinks that because we're south of Tucson and Phoenix that it must be hotter than Tucson and Phoenix. But that's not, we're actually a bit cooler. So our summers aren't horrible, except the flip side is that it's kind of chilly right now. But I mean, it's still hotter than like most of the US, but it's not like death hot. Like we almost never get over 100 degrees. Yes, and Doug Stanhope does live here, and sometimes I look over his fence because his house is really cool, but I haven't yet to actually meet him. All right, enough random Bisbee talk for a minute, though I could have random Bisbee talk all day because I love Bisbee. But all right, so here we have this little thing. What were we even doing with this? Oh yes, we were talking about routers. Cool, so let's talk about how to move these out, right? Because we also want our items, right? So API.items. We have coffee beans, more coffee beans, some tea, etc. So, and then, you know, we have post. All right, cool. Okay, so now we have these six endpoints, and we can see that it's already starting to get pretty crowded in here, and these are way shorter than real route handlers would be. So we can already kind of start to feel this need to separate things out a little bit. Yes, we'll also put in our items chocolate syrup. That's all you need to run a coffee shop is coffee beans, more coffee beans, some tea, and chocolate syrup. All right, so let's go ahead and create ourselves a router. So we had this, I already created this user router. Let me create a new file in here called item router. Cool. All right, so the first step is we need Express. And then the next step, which was one of my little Easter eggs and find the differences, is we need to create a router. And so the way you create a router is, it turns out there is just a method on the Express object. So Express is both a function that you can call, but it's also an object that has some methods on it. And one of those is a router. So we can, instead of creating a full Express app, we can create a single router instead. And we kind of have a sense already of what a router is. A router is like a separate piece. And yeah, I can go back over to the index real quick. Don't worry about copying all this down. We're moving most of this logic. The point of me busting this out was mostly to remind you guys, yes, we don't want all of this in one giant file. So the router is like a little independent piece of our server. It doesn't have to listen. The listen only happens in needs to happen in one place, but it can do a lot of the other things that the app or the server can do. And in that way, we can separate out concerns. So what we would like to do is separate out all these supplier related, oh wait, I wanted to do supplier, not item, sorry. We'll do item soon. So let's just create a new file for that. Oh wait, I just did item router again. Supply router. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and copy this over. All right, so we have this supply router. So we wanna take all these supply related, or supplier, not supply. So we want to take all these supplier related endpoints and move them out of here. All right, so let's go ahead and for starters, we'll just copy and paste them. And this question, do we need both server and router files? Yes. So and that actually gets at a deeper question, which is, do we need both a server and a router? And the answer is, you can write an Express app without routers, as we've seen, but you can't write it without the server. So this thing is necessary. We can't just totally skip this step because we need to create a server and we need to have server.listen on it. Maybe that's the simplest way to understand it, is that the server is the only thing that can listen. The router will be hooked into the server. So this is kind of like the trunk of the tree, and each router is going to be like a branch of the tree. Next question is it a common pattern to tie individual resources to their routers? Yes. I mean, there are a few different ways to think about this. We'll explore in just a minute or a little bit later why this can get a little hazy, but one really good starting point in thinking about how you want to organize your routers is organize them by resources. But I will say it's not the only way to organize. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and actually copy and paste all these guys over. We need to, all right, let's actually, what is the first step in getting this thing up and running? What is the most immediate change I need to make here? We need to change the word server to router. Absolutely. Server is not a thing over here. The next thing, which you guys mentioned, is we need to actually add the files to index. So we need to connect this back over to the index. So we can do that in just a minute. Another question is it best practice to have a router for each resource? Not necessarily. It is definitely best practice to have routers and to separate things out into routers, you know, unless you just have a couple endpoints. But as far as how to organize the routers, there are different ways to do it, and this is just one. So this is good practice, but there are other correct ways to do this that are a little more sophisticated. So let's just start with this one and not worry about other ways to do it, but also keep in mind that this is not the only way. Okay. So let's talk about actually connecting these two files. So we're going to need a module exports. Remember, whenever we want to take a file and use that logic somewhere else, we better have some exports. So I'm just going to export this router. So as you've seen, sometimes you might have multiple functions or multiple objects on the exports. In this case, just the router is going to be the entire export. And then over here, of course, we're going to need to require it. So I'll say supplier router equals require. And JS is optional, but I'll put it in. Okay. Now we need to plug it in. So as someone mentioned earlier, this thing is actually middleware. So how do you think we are going to plug in our router? Any ideas? Server.use. Yep. And there is one slight difference here. We can't just plug it in. Well, we could just plug it in, but there's another little shortcut we can do. We can actually put an endpoint on here. Okay, so what we're saying is if this is the beginning of our endpoint, redirect it over to this router. So a little bit different than just plugging the middleware directly in. As we've seen, we actually do need an endpoint, or at least the base of an endpoint, and then we put the router in. So we're saying for endpoints that start with this, use this router. Oop, and I accidentally, you're right, it's module.export, not exports. My bad. Oh wait, something else crashed, or is it? I don't know. Now I'm overthinking everything. No, it is exports. What else has gone wrong? Something has gone wrong. Let's find out. Router.use. Requires begotten object. Something's gone wrong here. All right, let's see. So it's coming from line index. Wait. Okay, whatever. I think it seems to be working. Okay. When I exported it, why not supplier router? Just a choice. I like to name variables camel case, and I like to name files with an underscore, but I could have named it this if I wanted. There's really no good answer to that. I wouldn't overthink it. Oops. So don't get bogged down on that one. It's just a naming choice. Cool. So let's see if our endpoints are working. I'll give you a hint. They're not going to work. All right. Something went wrong. Ruh-roh. What is it? I'll give you a hint. It's in here. Anyone see what? There's one more step we have to do to get this up and running. I still have the endpoints. So yes, because we have a base attached to this, this is actually a get for API suppliers / API suppliers. It's redundant. We put it in twice, and let's even confirm that over here. Yeah, so that's not what we want. That's not what we meant. So because the base has already been defined, all we have to do is either put a slash in, or if there's more to the name, we can put that in. So this is actually for that endpoint, and this is actually for ID. So let's go over that again. Over here, we've defined the base of the endpoint. So everything inside of this router already has this attached. So this now looks like the root, which doesn't mean really the root. It means the root of this endpoint base. So now let's make sure this works. Cool. Looks good. Okay, so we have just created our first router. So I want to give you guys some time to catch up, and I also want to give you a break. And we're a little behind schedule. We ended up spending a little more time than I had hoped on on that middleware at the beginning, though I'm glad we did because I wanted to make sure you guys got that. So let me go ahead. I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and it'll be kind of a combination of a break / catching up. So you guys can catch up / take a break, and I'll answer any questions you have while we do that. So let's go ahead and start there. Oops. And I know you guys probably want to see both files, so I'll try and, yeah, and I'll honestly just close out my terminal for now. So let's the index. Does it matter where I define and use the routers in index? I mean, you have to, generally you want to actually define or require it up top. I like to actually separate it between the modules, the node modules I'm requiring versus the files. As far as where we use it, it has to be before the listen. It has to be after this middleware if we want this middleware to be used in this for these endpoints. If we didn't want this middleware to be used. And then we would, as far as where it goes here, it could be after these items, endpoints, or before. That doesn't matter. Are we already in the break yet? I've set a 10-minute timer so we can, and it'll give you a chance both to catch up and take the break. So I'd say let's catch up first and then you can go on your break. So I'll be kind of answering questions. So I would say try and catch up and then you'll have a chance to take your break. Is there an advantage to using routers beyond just keeping code organized? Yes. And that is something I'm going to talk about more after the break, but it's a way of organizing middleware. So I could plug in middleware right here and it's going to only apply to suppliers. So if I had some middleware specific or some supplier specific middleware, this would be a really easy way for me to make sure that it's hitting all the supplier endpoints and nothing else. So there's a slightly more practical reason to use routers. Where does the supplier router come from? I'm just requiring this file over here. One more thing I want to say about this question of is there an advantage to using routers other than cleaner and more organized code? As I mentioned, there is, but I also don't want you guys to think of cleaner or more organized code as being a secondary concern. As I was trying to emphasize at the beginning, cleaner and more organized code should be of the utmost importance. And for anyone who's feeling lost, after the break here, I'm going to go ahead and do a little recap of everything we just went through and answer any outstanding questions that you guys have. It is exports. So module.exports. And if you ever have any doubts on that, you can, well, first you can just see if your code crashes or not, but it's also very easily Googleable. Plural, yes, exports. And if you don't get every single one of these endpoints, I know I busted these out pretty quickly. If you don't get all of these copied on over, don't worry about it. It's more the idea of making sure that the idea of understanding that everything can be separated into a single file. All right, so let's go over this again. So an express router is kind of like a mini express app. It's a little different than an express app. We don't have to listen, for example, and in fact shouldn't listen. We create it in a slightly different way using express.router instead of just express. But apart from that, it works pretty similar to an express app. We can attach middleware to it. If we had some, some bit of middleware here that was only applicable to suppliers, we could put it in here. I'm not actually going to write any out, but we could put middleware in here. We could, we can write endpoints. We can do all sorts of stuff. So it's like a little mini section of our Express app. And the reason we like this, or we like to be able to do this, one is it can help us separate out our middleware in a more meaningful way, but it also just helps keep our files clear so that we don't end up with an index.js that has 80 different endpoints in it, or even 10 different endpoints in it. So in the case of managing multiple resources, you generally are going to want to create routers for each of your resources. As I mentioned, there are other ways you might choose to organize your code, but a good starting point is one router per resource. And I'd encourage you to use that for the homework tonight. So we see that there we have this. So let's look at how to actually connect this in. So I've created my router. This is kind of useless middleware because nothing's happening in it. I guess I better press next or it will crash my code. We'll do a little insert logic here. Imagine that this middleware, we're actually doing something. We define all our endpoints, and then we export the router. So over here on our main server, we can require that router, and then we can plug it on in using the base of the endpoint and then the router, and just that same server.use syntax that we've been using in general for middleware. So that is how you create a router, attach it to the main app, and yeah, and keep yourself from having a crazy long file full of all sorts of semi-unrelated things. Do you guys have any questions on that before we move on? See a couple people typing, so I will wait for those to come through. Yep, so we are going to have 2 router files for items and suppliers. And on the homework tonight, you should have 2 routers, one for users and one for posts. Please scroll on supplier router. Here you go. Scroll down on supplier router. Okay. Can 2 resources use an identical endpoint? No, there would be no way to differentiate between the endpoint. So, like if you're, when you actually pinged localhost 400 or whatever I'm on, 5050 /API/whatever, there needs to be some way to tell Express where we need to go. So on the note of each resource having a different router, I'm going to write a router for our items. And sorry, let me answer one more question before we do that. Question is, where do we write the middleware, in the router or in a separate file? That's up to you. If you just had one piece of middleware in here, I would probably just write it in the file. But if you have a bunch of middleware in here, it might be wise to separate it out. And we're getting into the territory where there's no right answer. There's definitely wrong ways to do things. I will say that, like, if you have everything clumped in one file and it's unreadable, I don't think that's the right way. But there isn't one single right way. And one of the challenges / one of the fun parts of being a developer is figuring out what is a sensible way to organize your code. Is this worth modularizing out, or am I just, there is such thing as over modularizing, I believe. Yep, and it also depends on the standards of your, ideally you'll be on a project where it's clear someone has architected and made those decisions. But sometimes you'll be on a project where it's kind of a free-for-all. So, all right, so let's go ahead and talk about this item router. So what I want is, I'm actually going to set this 10 minutes again in just a moment, and I want you guys to create an item router. So I've created a file already it's almost blank. Create an item router file, actually move those endpoints over. And I will, just to keep things simple, because I don't want to bog you guys down on any extra work that you don't need. If you want to write extra endpoints, that's fine, but just do the get. I think the get is perfectly fine. So go ahead and create an item router and move the get request out of the main server, out of index.js and into the item router. So I'm going to start this timer. I can keep answering questions while you guys go. I want you guys to work on this. I'll check in, or maybe around 6 or 7 minutes, see how you're doing, and then we'll go through it together. I want you guys to practice this because it's important. Question about requiring: you do not have to include the extension for JavaScript files. You save yourself a tiny bit of extra work on the back end, because there are a couple things have to happen behind the scenes to figure out that it's a JavaScript file. So I don't know, that's preference. You can, if it's a JavaScript file, you can just do that if you want. That's also acceptable. And once again, as far as this best practice thing, that's going to be up to you, or up to the code base you're working on. And if you guys need me to scroll around at all, let me know. So because there's another router, we will need another server.use with this time API/items. And then we can plug in our item router to that. All right, I'm going to submit a poll and see how you guys are doing. If you're not ready, I'll give you a few more minutes to work on this. All right, I'm seeing mostly agrees and strongly agrees, though I've only gotten 8 votes. So I'll let a few more of you guys vote. All right, looks like it's time for us to move on. So I'll stop the timer and let's go over how to create this new route together. So step 1 would be creating a file for it. I already did that. So I'm going to go ahead and require that. So we'll do a item router equals require routers item. So now we have access to this router. Right now we have access to nothing because nothing is being exported, but we'll get to that. So we have to use it. So server.use, a different endpoint, API/items. We'll plug it in. Oops. Item router. Cool. All right. So that's really all we have to do. We know we don't want these in here anymore. Let me copy this over. Cool. So look how much cleaner. This file almost fits. I almost don't even have to scroll. So this is super clean right now. Let me go ahead and move that over to the item router. So I've already have a few things set up here. I've required Express. I've created my router using Express's router method. And then what do I need to change? There are just a couple things I need to change on here to get this up and running. Who can tell me? Server needs to become router, absolutely. We need to change the endpoint, right? This is already part of it. So this is actually API items. And then we have to export it. Perfect. All right, let's restart that server and see if this works. Where's my postman? Okay, let's try items. Cool, looks good. And if you were trying to create the delete and the post endpoints, that's perfectly fine, but also not necessary. You will have a chance to do that on the homework tonight. All right, so there is one more thing I want to talk about when it comes to this multiple resource thing, which is that the most interesting complexity that arises when you have multiple resources isn't just the amount of code and organizing it. The interesting thing is actually how are these items related to each other? And this is a very brief intro to how we're going to have to think when we start working with databases next week. So how is an item related to a supplier? And a supplier ID, that does relate to it, but even in just more general terms, you know, suppliers sell items. Yeah, so each item is going to be connected to a supplier, whereas suppliers are connected to many items, presumably. So that's going to be actually reflected in the code. So what we would see is that the items would actually look more like this. So, and we're just going to assume that our coffee roaster is vendor 1, food vendor is vendor 2, and the tea person is vendor 3. So we're actually going to see, I guess I could have probably done this in a more clever way. So each of these items needs to be assigned a supplier ID. Cool. So I'm bringing this up because this is an important piece of the homework you're going to be doing tonight. And I think one of the biggest gotchas. And once you do databases, this will make perfect sense. But you're in this weird stage where you have to start to kind of think about databases without fully understanding what's going on behind the scenes. But in order for your database code to work properly on the homework, you need to remember that each post has a user and is associated with a user. So when you do a GET request to posts on the homework tonight, you're going to see that there's an ID. But more importantly, when you actually post a new post, it will fail unless it has a valid user ID. So make sure that when you're testing out your homework tonight, that you're using valid user IDs on your posts, or else you'll encounter a problem. How do we know the ID? Well, I kind of made this up, but what you would do, let me, basically like this, and I won't waste our time doing the rest of them. So if we did a GET request to suppliers, so let's say I wanted to post a new, I wanted to post a new item. I'll actually, let me bring in the post code real quick. I shouldn't have deleted this. All right, so let's play around. In fact, we're just gonna forget the code for a minute. Let's just play around here. So let's say that I wanted to create a new item for decaf beans. So I know that needs to go with my distributor or my supplier, the coffee bean supplier, but I need to know their ID. So what I would do, and this is just for the purpose of the homework, it gets more sophisticated when you get into actually writing this with an app. But for the homework tonight, what you could think about is, okay, well, let me start by doing a GET request to my users, or in this case, suppliers. And I see, okay, the coffee roaster has an ID 1. And I got lazy, but imagine the rest of these had ID 2 and ID 3. So I know, okay, ID 1 is a valid ID for my coffee roaster. So now I could post to items, go over to my body and say name, and then let's say SID is equal to 1. And because there's no real database here, I could have left this out, or I could have come up with a bogus number. And in this toy app, it would have been fine. But in the homework tonight, there's a real database. So you have to make sure that the IDs you're using are valid. So there we go. Now we've sudo posted a new item into the database. All right. The other place this gets tricky, maybe I shouldn't even bring, actually, I'm sorry that I started saying something. I'm not going to say what I was going to say because I think it will create more confusion than anything else. And we're getting low on time. So you'll just have to wonder forever what I was going to say. All right. I think we're just about ready to move on to deployment. Does anyone have any questions about routers or multiple resources or mixing IDs, like any of this before we move on to deployment? You guys are just going to ask what the thing I was going to say is. So many questions. If you want to pick one or two, you're welcome to ask. If you're feeling totally lost about this, please reach out to me or one of the PMs after the lecture and we can help you work through it a little bit. Still confused about the ID thing. So I wish I had a copy of the homework so I could talk about how it works there. I'll talk more about the ID thing at the very end of the lecture so that I can really put it in the context of the homework before you guys go and work on that. So if I don't, remind me, I have a note to talk about it anyways, again, at the end, but would it be helpful to have the schema from the assignment? So you don't have the full SQL schema, but that was one thing I was going to bring up at the end is there is a schema. So notice that posts, they have their own ID because each resource is going to have an ID, but they also have a user ID. So this ID, user ID, needs to match the ID field from a user object. So if you're trying to post something, make sure that you first do a GET request to users and you find a valid ID so that the post can actually be assigned to someone, because we don't want to have disembodied posts. All right, I'm going to move on to deployment. So let's start by a little, what is deployment? So we've been using localhost for all this, which localhost is great. It allows us to run our servers on our local machines and play with them and test them and make sure they're working. But if you want your app to ever be live, that's deployment. Deployment is actually putting it on some server in some warehouse in the Midwest or wherever it's being stored so that it can be broadcasted across the internet so that anyone can access it from anywhere. And deployment it's a big topic. To really understand deployment is actually not something we really want or need to do as web developers. DevOps people are responsible for deploying. You know, I haven't, until I deployed something prepping for this lecture, I hadn't deployed anything in years because I had my DevOps people to do that for me. And it can get complex, but it's important to understand just the basics of it. And it's also just nice to know a couple simple ways to deploy basic apps in case you want to. So we are going to be using a tool called Heroku to deploy. And it's a nice little, we want to practice basic deployment. If you had a production app, you would most likely not be deploying it on Heroku. But it's a good starting point and it's a good way to understand some of the basics of deployment. Yes, AWS would be a much better choice if you had something, if you had a production app you wanted to deploy. But we'll be using a tool called Heroku. So I hope that you guys all already created Heroku accounts. If you haven't, please do that now. It's just Heroku.com. Creating an account's pretty simple. You'll just, you know, they'll send you an email, you'll confirm, and ta-da, you have a Heroku account. So if you haven't already done this, please catch up and do this now so that we can go and deploy together. Did we ever find out if we have to remove the dev dependencies? Yes. So actually, Heroku will, I was going to bring this up later, Heroku will automatically remove those for us. So I'll show you when that happens. All right. So Heroku integrates really nicely with GitHub. So we have to make sure that our repo is up on GitHub. And this kind of came up on Monday, but let's walk through how to do this. So in order to get this thing up on GitHub, we first want to create a new Git repository. So if you've already gotten this on GitHub, you can skip this step, but if you haven't, so go to GitHub, sign in, create a new repo. I'm going to call this, middleware, even though we've kind of gotten past middleware at this point. So I will create this repository. Cool. So now we have a place for this to go. And we don't want anything in this. We don't want, it has all these suggestions about yeah, there are different ways to initialize it, but we want to push up our code. So did I misselecting node? Oh well. All right, so notice that there is some suggestions about creating all these things. Remember, oh, well, we didn't do a README, but we already did everything else on Monday. And then, okay, so let's make sure that we can push this thing. So I'm gonna start by doing a get status. I see that there's a bunch of untracked stuff. I'm just going to do get add all. And this is not good get practice. If I were actually trying to get properly, I would have been doing commits throughout this entire thing, but we'll just do one big blanket commit. So get commit message added stuff. Not a good git commit either. Cool. So let me get rid of some of these things real quick. So that we can see the terminal a little better. Okay, so I've added everything, get status, we're clean. Okay, so now I need to add a remote. So the code is get remote, add origin, and in fact, that's all pretty much here. So, and there's instructions over here. We already did the get init on Monday. But we've added everything, we've committed it. Now we have to add this remote. So you can copy it from here or just copy this URL. Oops, we need a space though. I screwed up. Let me, let's try that again. Okay. And then the next step is so this step is saying, hey, this is the repository online. I'd like to connect to this physical repository. And then we're going to push up our code while adding an upstream. Go away. Okay. Cool. And let's make sure it's up here. Nice. Looks good. Some very vague commit messages, but it is up on Git. So let me give you guys a second to catch up with that. I want you guys to create a Git repository, create a new repository, and go ahead and add, commit, add the origin, and then push. So, and if you guys need me to walk through any of that again, let me know. But let's all get on the same page here. Again, okay. So if you're on your main GitHub page, well, no, that's not. I want to be on my dashboard. So where is my, sorry. Or I think it's just the homepage. Okay, there it is. So the homepage of GitHub, and there's a little new button. So that's the first starting place. As we go to the homepage of GitHub, there's a new button. We name our repository. We don't want to add any of these because we're going to connect it to what we already have. Okay. So now we've already get initted. We don't need to add a README. So we want to do get add. So get add all, the dot for all. And then that'll add all our files, then get commit with a message. It says nothing to commit because I just committed. And then once you've done that, you want to copy over these next two files or these next two commands. So get remote, add origin, and then whatever the URL is to your new repository. And then you'll push -u for upstream origin master. And you should be able to click on this and actually see your files up there. Which files are we sending to this repo? So we're trying to send this little app that we've created here. So you might not have the custom middleware or anything, but hopefully you have some routers and you have an index.js here. If you haven't been coding along, I'm afraid we might be at the point where you'll just have to kind of watch the video and try along with it later. So if you guys don't have a repo, then Yeah, sorry. But yeah, you can just work on this later, but I would just pay attention and see what you can pick up. Actually, one thing I am going to do real quick here is I'm going to add a root. I realize this thing doesn't have, oops, wait, does it? Let me go over to my index.js. Yeah, there's no root endpoint in here. So let's go ahead and just do server.get / if you want to add a, if you want to add a little root endpoint, that might make things a little easier as we do this. If you don't, it'll be okay. But I'm just going to quickly add this. Okay, and then I'll have to push it again. All right. So I haven't put this root on any of the routers, so this is just its own thing. So if we started the server and we went to localhost 5050, this is what we would get. So this is the, I'm not sure I fully understand your question. The endpoint will show up always. So this isn't associated with any of the routers. We don't need that API / this or API / that base. We can still go to those /items and get that, but it's just a different endpoint. Think of it as like the home page for the site. Yep, no need to use exact like in React. As long as it's not in the router, it's not going to be part of the router. Cool. All right, so let me do a quick poll here. Okay, so I want to know if you guys have gotten to the point where you can actually, no, that's not. Let's go to middleware. Where you can actually see your code in the repo. So you successfully pushed your code up to the repo. All right, for those of you who haven't, all right? Seems like everyone has. If you haven't, last chance to ask a question. Looks like most of us have those. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on. If you wanna ask more questions about this later, I'm happy to help you with it. So now that this is up in GitHub, we wanna connect Heroku. So go over to Heroku, sign in. Give you guys a second to catch up on that. All right, I'm seeing a couple people who haven't gotten their repos up. I'll give you guys like 1 more minute to do that. But if you're stuck on something, please let me know so I can help you out. Otherwise, I'll just give you 1 more minute to see if you can get it there. In the meantime, Heroku. All right, I think we're just going to move on. So we want to create a new app. We can name it whatever we want. There's a lot of these are reserved, so you have to come up with something kind of weird. So like I couldn't just do middleware. There's already, but I could do middleware. But I just pick some random numbers. Create the app. So click the Create App button on the main page of Heroku once you've signed in. Come up with a unique name, and then create the app. So the next step is you're going to have to connect to GitHub. And so I've already connected to GitHub, so this automatically pops up, but you'll have to do a quick little approval thing to get your GitHub to connect to Heroku. Once it's connected, you'll see your name pop up, and you can go ahead and find the repo that you're looking for. So cool, there's mine. So connect, nice. All right, so I created a new Heroku app. I went ahead and connected my GitHub. And then once I did that, I was able to search for middleware and find the actual repo to connect to. Do you guys have any questions on this step? All right, the next thing we want to do is enable automatic deploys. So all that means is that every time I push a new version, it's going to automatically redeploy. So nice thing to have. And the automatic redeploys will be from a specific branch. We'll do master. Master is the only branch we have right now. In the real world, what would happen is you would have some sort of development branch or feature branches, and you would, change those and potentially push those. And then at some point, you would be ready to launch a new feature and you'd push that into master and redeploy master. But right now it's just every time we push a change, it redeploys, but that's fine. So I'm going to enable that. And then we're going to have to manually deploy it the very first time. So we enabled automatic deploys. Now we're going to see if our app works. So this is the build. If you notice, there was a little section called pruning dev dependencies. So that answered this question we had yesterday about dev dependencies. At least Heroku will automatically get rid of those for us. Cool, so now it says that our app was successfully deployed. So let's view it. And this is the most disappointing part of Heroku. I remember the first time I did Heroku, I was so excited, and then it turned out that my app was not actually working. So this will happen sometimes. So we're going to troubleshoot this, but before we do that, is everyone up to this point? Any questions on how to get to this point? I know, it's like 10 minutes to the end of lecture and we're like, we're there. No, we're not really there. We're close though. All right, so a good place to start. We know the build worked all right. But there's another thing we can check. If you go back to this screen and see there's a little more option here, we can view the logs. The logs are a good place to check if something's not working. Uh-oh. Can you guys see what went wrong based on these logs? I'll give you a hint. Look at the first line of the logs. It doesn't like node them on. So let's bounce back here and let's look at our package.json. So our start script. When we deploy this, Heroku is set up where it's going to use our start script. But what does our start script point to? Not so good, right? So our start script, which the deployment engine will use, points to a dev dependency. So this was not good. What we might have done instead is actually create a different command for development so that we could make node be this one. So start is going to be used in deployment. So make sure that your start script doesn't actually point to node or nodemon unless you're not planning on deploying anything. All right, so what I've just done is I've changed this so that if I want to use Yarn server, that will start nodemon and I can develop with that. But the deployment engine will use start, which doesn't rely on a dev dependency. So let me go ahead and add that, commit. And then, okay. So when I push this, it'll automatically redeploy. Server does not need to say nodemon index because nodemon actually knows to just look at what the main script is. So I could have typed out index.js here, but the command on its own is totally fine. It'll actually link in with that main script there. Actually, will that, yeah. Okay, so let's go back here. Overview. Okay, we can see it built successfully again, it deployed again. Let's see if it works now. Uh-oh. We're getting the spinny wheel of doom here. So something else is wrong. So we could check the logs again. I will tell you right now, the logs probably won't help us. So I won't make you guys play any more guessing games. I'll tell you what else is wrong here. And this is the #1 easiest mistake to make when you're first deploying. And it can be a total tear your hair out thing unless you know this. So listen closely. This is really common issue. So we had this conversation on, I think, night 1 about, what is a server and where does a server live? Well, a server needs an IP address and a port. This server is set up to run on localhost, right? And when it comes to localhost, we know that there are a bunch of unreserved ports, right? So as long as we pick a number basically between 3,000 and 9,000 or something like that, we'll be fine. However, that's not going to be the case when it comes to Heroku. So Heroku has a bunch of servers, presumably somewhere in a warehouse in the Midwest, and they have a lot of ports. But Heroku doesn't just have a bunch of random open ports. They want to utilize their ports smartly. So what they will do is they actually assign you a port. So when you deploy something, they're going to assign you an IP address and assign you a port. How do we make sure that port equals what their port is, though? It turns out there's actually a pretty simple solution to this. So there is a variable called process.env. This is an object. This is designed to house all the, if we want to, we can just console log this right now. Oops, didn't mean to do that. So if we go ahead and now we can do yarn server And we see there actually is some stuff on here. We're not going to go into the weeds of what all this business actually is, but needless to say, there's this useful little variable called process.env, which will give us some nice information about what environment we're running our app on. What not only Heroku, but any deployment engine will do is assign your port to process.env.port. So right now, it's undefined because we haven't assigned it to anything. But when we deploy it, Heroku will. So what we can actually do is change this little port assignment to this. So this bit of code, what it's saying is if this environment port exists, let's use that one. Otherwise, we'll just default to 50/50 because we're probably running it locally. So now we can actually set port equal to Heroku's intended port for us. All right, so let's go ahead and once again, even though I keep saying Heroku will do this, any deployment engine will do this. So you don't have to be scratching your heads about where the port's going to be. This is the place where you look for the port in production. So let me go ahead and add that. Commit, added port. Right, we know that pushing this will auto deploy. So let's go ahead and see. Is process part of Express? No, that is a node thing. I believe so, yeah. I should double check. Yeah, I've used it without using Express. Okay, so we see the build has succeeded. So it's been redeployed. We are live, it worked. Let's try. And we can hit our other endpoints too. Cool. All right, I know it's been a long and grueling lecture, and some of you guys are probably still catching up on this, but do you guys have any questions about this? I think that's the silence of our brain hurts. So this is live. So you could at home go to, actually, I'm gonna make a little request. Those of you guys who have deployed successfully, share this link in Slack. So I went to, over here, you can say open app, and it'll open it. So notice that if, we open Brandon's middleware over here, it works, right? So this is not a local host thing anymore. I was able to open Brandon's middleware on my computer because they're all, so that's pretty cool, right? And that's what deployment means. The bad news is this only was so easy because this is a very, very simple server. And if we were trying to do this with a database, life gets a lot more complicated. There are a bunch of different add-ons and different things you can do with Heroku, but it gets increasingly more difficult. But if you don't have any data persistence, it's pretty easy to deploy. Another thing I want to note about Heroku is there's a nifty little command line tool. So if you guys want to play with that, there's pretty detailed instructions on Heroku's site about how to use that. All right, so I'm going to talk through the homework real quick. So a lot of the stuff we talked about tonight, you will not need for the homework, specifically the deployment. And as I mentioned, if you try to deploy this, you might have some trouble because of the database. We see you make a post? Yes and no. I mean, really, no, we can't because it's complicated. Basically, because there's no data persistence, we could try it through Postman, but nothing would really change. But let's go ahead and try it. So let's go to Where is it? We might have, I don't think we'll have a cores issue. There's a chance we might. All right, let's try it out. Dang. Oh, I have an extra slash in there. Let's try it now. Woo! All right, we were able to post to it, even though nothing interesting actually happened behind the scenes. We got a response that implied something was created in a database, but it's a lie. How do we stop deploying? So if we wanted to take this down, we could, I'm sure there's a way to just temporarily take it down. You could delete the app altogether. I'm actually not sure offhand. So we can delete it if we want. I'm sure there's also a way to, let's try and deploy. So we could, I don't see an undeploy. We could disconnect. That would probably do it too. I don't know. I'm sure you could tinker with it and figure it out. Or resources. Is that how we do it? No. I wonder if we go here. Yeah. I don't know if there's a way to, an easy way to toggle it on and off, but we can definitely delete it pretty easily. Oh, okay. Let's see. There we go. So, wait, there's a, where is it? Settings, maintenance mode. Okay, cool. Good job. That, I guess, is the easy way to do it. If I had just read the description, I would have figured it out sooner. All right, well, maybe I will enable maintenance mode, as beautiful as my little sad little app was. All right, let's talk about the homework so you guys can get working on that. So for the homework, you want to create your new resource, right? So it doesn't really talk about routers in here, but I definitely want to see you guys making 2 routers, one for the users and one for the posts. And then you'll build your post endpoints. The biggest 2 things that are going to be different on this, the first one is using the routers. The second one is going to be this thing that I mentioned several times, which is that posts have a user ID field. This needs to be a valid user ID. Just do a get request to users and you can pick from any of the IDs that pop up. I just wanted to mention that 8 more times because I don't want you pulling out your hair trying to figure out why you can't create a post when the reason is just that your user ID doesn't match a valid user ID. So that is the gist of it. Everyone who feels good and confident and ready to jump off and work on the homework, please do so. If you guys want to stick around and ask some more questions, I will. Does it mention cores? Oh man, I am so sorry. We did not talk about cores yet. So yes, cores. I'm trying to figure out if I want to open that rabbit hole now. I might just make you guys Google that. The short answer with cores is that there is a very easy bit of middleware called cores, and it's super easy to implement. As far as what cores actually is, that's a little more complex of a topic, but it's essentially our way of making sure that our APIs aren't public. So maybe I don't want just anyone hitting my API and getting my data. Cores will help prevent strange people from accessing my data, but putting in the cores middleware allows it to be exposed. So I wouldn't worry too much about the cores piece if you don't want to. Focus on the routers, focus on getting your endpoints together. If you want to add in cores, feel free to look at the documentation for that, or find a video or a blog article about what cores is and how it works. And I apologize for not going over that. I probably should have covered that on Monday. My bad. And I also want to remind you guys about tags. The tag piece, if you don't want to use the tags, you don't have to, but there is some tag functionality built in if you feel like playing with it. As far as cores, it's a little off topic for the next lecture, but if you guys want to hear about it, yeah, I can mention it, or I can just talk about it for a little bit right now. The homework does have a real database, so if you try and deploy it, it won't work very well. I will say, I'm gonna say for now, cores is a learn about it on your own topic. If you guys are really curious about it or want to hear more about it, let me know and I will discuss it in the next lecture. Will we need cores for the sprints? Nothing will break. It won't break if you don't put in cores. So if you skip it, you'll be fine. But it is a good thing to know about it. Yes. There is a nice little boilerplate for it. It's like I said, even though it's a little more complex to understand, it's super easy to put in the middleware. Those 2 lines of code Julie just posted will take care of that. All right, any other questions? And as I said, I know it's past 9 at this point, so if anyone wants to hop out and start on the homework, feel free. But I want to make sure that any questions get answered before I let you guys go. All right, everyone's being pretty quiet. I know we covered a lot tonight. So the good news is that most of this homework is more of the same. Really, one of the biggest challenges is just separating things out in the routers. A lot of what we talked about tonight with the deployment isn't even going to come up on the homework, so it's good stuff to know. And as far as the cores goes, useful thing to know, but for right now, you will only need it if you're doing the stretch goal with the React app. Just make sure that you use the cores library and plug in the cores middleware. And Julie has posted the 2 lines of code that it will take to do that. All right, you guys are being pretty quiet. Oh wait, now people are typing again. Sorry, give me 1 more second to see if we have a few more questions coming in. Cool, thank you for sharing that little link for a little intro on what cores is. That's awesome. All right, well, I'm gonna let you guys go and work on the homework. We've gone a little over time. Try and do as much as you can tonight, but you will have some time to work on it tomorrow as well. All right, that is it for this week, and that's it for this 4-lecture section. So next week, we are going to be starting on databases, and databases will be kind of interrupted because we'll have a week of databases, then it's Christmas break, and then we'll finish it up come the new year. So I will see you guys next week, and good luck. As always, please reach out to each other, reach out to the PMs, and if you're completely stuck on something, reach out to me as well. I don't want you guys getting bogged down on something and not making any progress. So definitely ask for help if you need it. All right, guys, good luck with the homework. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next week.